Howdy YouTube pards. This is Jack Spade here, coming to you from High Noon Leatherworks, where we're going to show you step by step how to create leather goods from patterns all the way to the finished product. Stay tuned. Howdy YouTube pards. Jack Spade back again from High Noon Leatherworks for another episode. Third episode for making a leather belt. And the leather belt we've been making is basket weave stamped. I'll bring you on in a little closer here in a minute, and I'll show you everything that we're going to use this episode to finish this belt. We've already done the stamping, we've already done the beveling, we've already done the burnishing, so it's ready to be dyed. And I'll show you what dye I'm going to use and show you the hardware that I'm going to use, and let's go ahead and get started. Alright, in this episode we're going to go ahead and finish this belt up. I did go ahead since the last episode and I made my leather retaining loop, and that's just a small, I just used a scrap piece of leather and then I cross stitched it together, and that's what's gonna go on the inside of where the buckle goes, and that's just gonna retain my excess part of my belt strap. So I made that ahead of time. Like I said, it was just out of a scrap piece of leather and cross stitch, so pretty simple to make. Also, we're going to use small punch, hole punch today. We're going to use some 3/8 standard rivets in silver. And I'm going to try to use 4 of those on this project, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. Let me move those out of the way. Here's the buckle we're going to use, and it does have on the end, it does have a roller, so that does keep the wear down on the leather when you pull the belt through it. And then I have a rivet setter. I'll show you how to use that when we put the rivets in. And of course I'll need my mallet. And then I'm going to use some vinyl gloves. You don't want to get this dye on your fingers or your hands, because it will dye your skin and it'll just have to wear off. You're not going to wash it off. But I'm going to use Fibings dye today, and I'm going to use medium brown is the color I'm going to use. And then I have a small shallow dish that I'm going to pour that dye into. It just makes it much simpler to access with my dauber, and it also keeps the mess down from around your dye, so dipping it in the actual container. So, and these are like a dozen of them for $1 at the dollar store, so I just buy and pick them up whenever I see them there, package or two, and then when I'm done with them, it makes cleanup real simple. I pull off my vinyl gloves and put this inside my dauber and throw it in the trash. And that makes it real nice and clean. So let's go ahead and get started with the dyeing. As you can see, my dyeing mat, as I call it, all it is a water heater, piece of cardboard off a water heater box, and I kept these and cut several of them to have because it's super thick and stiff. So the dye's not going to soak through. You can see I've used it a lot with different types of dye, different colors, and there's nothing that's ever soaked through to the other side. So that's what we're going to use to put our piece on to dye so we don't get it on anything. I like to dye the edges first, then go to what will be my finished side, the front, and then go to the back. The back, the non-finished side of the leather is going to soak up the most dye, but I don't like putting things together first. Like, I don't want to put my buckle on and put my rivets in and then try to dye it, because if I do, I've got all this area here that's riveted and has my buckle on. I can't get dye in here. So I want to dye it first. So let's go ahead and get our vinyl gloves on, get ready to do our dyeing. We'll take our container, make sure you shake up your dye. Again, we're using Fibings medium brown. We're going to pour that about 3/4 of the way full. You can see I do have a few drips. And I'll take a paper towel or one of those throwaway shop towels, and I'll just wipe that off. And I'll probably be using it again here because I'm sure that small 3/4 of that small dish is not going to do it. And I'll clean up anything that got on my container. I like to keep my containers nice and clean. Anything that got on my lid, put my lid back on and just set it aside. Now you can tell it's super hard not to spill this stuff, but you can tell where I did spill over here. It's just going to sit and dry on that cardboard, so it's not going to hurt a thing. That's how all this gets on there over time. Let's go ahead and let's start with the holding strap that I made. I'll put a little bit of dye on my dauber, and you're going to get it on your gloves. There's no way you're going to keep it from getting on your gloves, especially when you're doing a small piece like this, because you have to hold it. There's no way around it. And we'll put a little bit more dye on the dauber, and we'll do the inside. If you want to flatten that out a little bit more, wipe off some excess off my gloves even. But if you want to flatten this loop out a little more, now would be the time to do it, because putting that dye on there will moisten that leather, so it does make it a little pliable to change the shape a little bit. You can squeeze down on those ends like so. Now to flatten that out a little more, kind of take that roundness out of it. I'll set it over to the side, and then we'll move on to the belt. Again, I'm going to do the edge first, or edges. And those Again, in the last episode, we burnished those edges. So they're nice and smooth. You want to stay over your cardboard piece as much as possible to catch any excess dye that might drip off your dauber. These wool daubers are pretty good about not letting anything drip off of them. They hold the dye really well. Okay, there's one side. We'll flip it over. We'll do the other side. We'll do the other edge. Again, the key when you're dyeing leather is to make sure you don't miss any spots. You know, there's some dyes that, like black. Black is really forgiving. You can get a good, dark, deep, rich black by putting on more than one coat, depending on how absorbent the leather is. Other dyes, especially the tans, I've found are a little more difficult. They will darken as you put more on it. So if you want to keep it that lighter shade when you apply it, then you only want to put one coat on. So that means, especially on the finish side, that means you have to put it on very evenly. So let's go ahead and do the finish side. Now, this will take a little bit of work with this dauber because of the indentions that the stamping made, that basket weave. This basket weave is going to look really good with this brown on it. Because it will get a couple of different shades because of the depth, kind of the 3D effect of the basket weave stamp. But if you go in a circular motion, that will pull a lot of that dye down in those grooves and into the stamping. So you can go in a circular motion both directions, clockwise, counterclockwise. And this dye will lighten up a little bit as it dries. And if you can go across that stamping, that pulls that dye down into those small, deep grooves that the stamp made. You don't want to leave it undyed, it just won't look right. So you may need to go over that and really put some pressure on that to pull that dye down in those deeper grooves, especially along the edge. And then you can always wipe off excess with a absorbent towel or rag if you think you have way too much on the top. Like I said, it will lighten up a little bit as it dries, so don't worry about it being too dark as you put your initial coat on. Again, these are pretty shallow dishes, so I'm using sparing amounts of dye as I put it into the container, and then clean my bottle back off. Keeps the air away from it, keeping the lid on there. And then just continue to dye on the finished side. And you want to try to continue as quickly as possible because you don't want differences in your dye between where you stopped and maybe refilled your container with dye, or you don't want to go answer a phone call or something and let that dry, because as that dries, it's going to not allow you to feather that in from where you stopped. Kind of like here, you can see where I feathered this in from where I started on. You can't even tell. But down here, obviously where I stopped, there's a pretty harsh mark. And if I let all that dry and then start dyeing again, it's probably going to show up, especially on lighter colors. So you want to be real careful about that. You want to try to continue dyeing while that's still good and moist. Again, you may have to really work that dye down in those grooves, because some of those stamping grooves are pretty deep in this leather. So it looks like it's going to take quite a bit of dye for this belt. I knew it would on the unfinished side, but I wasn't sure with all the stamping how much it was going to take on the finished side. It's going to take more than what I thought. So that's another thing. Once you pick your color, I always like to make sure that I have at least, especially on a project this size, a full bottle when I start. Because I don't want to attempt or guess, okay, I think it's going to take this much to complete this project, this much dye, and then I get halfway through the project and I run out of that color. So that's a real problem. So we're going to continue. Getting low on dye again. I'll have to put some more in my container, but let's see if we can get this little section done here. And you can actually see it coming out of the wool dauber and kind of running down into those little deep grooves in that basket weave. Basket weave looks really good with this color. I'll show you a closer view of that here in a minute. But the stamping turned out great. Again, when I do this, I'm just taking off that excess on the top because I had to put so much in there to get it down in those grooves. But you can see there's a shot of, if I can get it in the camera there. There we go. There's the unfinished leather, and then there's the finished medium brown dye. And you could tell it really pulls that basket weave stamping out of there. Really accentuates it, makes it look sharp. Put a little more dye in my container. And you'll see the change in the ease of dyeing this piece when I get down to where my holes are down here. This is smooth. We stopped back here by the last hole. We stopped back there with our basket weave stamp. So the dyeing process will be much quicker
and much smoother because we won't have to work as hard to get down into any basket weave grooves because the basket weave stops before we get down there. In fact, that's where I'm at now. I'm down to that point to where I'm doing the last part of the basket weave area on the belt. And I'm just taking excess off of that top layer. When I wipe that at the end. You kind of want to make random motions as you're putting that dye on there because you don't want streaks, so you don't want to just do vertical or horizontal strokes. Tight little figure 8 motions are really good when you're doing that. And there's the smooth part. And you can see where it transitions right into the basket weave. And then now, as I wiped the excess off as we went down, and I applied the dye on the finished side, now it's not dry by any means, but it's not going to rub off on my workbench or anything. So I can actually turn it over and start on the unfinished side. And if it's over here on my workbench, it's not going to hurt anything. So now this side, even though it's unfinished and it's going to soak up a lot of dye, I don't think it's going to take as long as the other side did, just because the other side we had to work harder at it to get it down in all those grooves. This side will soak it up pretty quick. But again, it's the unfinished side. You're not going to see it. Obviously, when you have the belt on, no one's going to see it. So my point to the unfinished side is I just want to get it coated even as possible. And again, you can see I'm using horizontal strokes on the unfinished side instead of figure 8 or random strokes. But it doesn't really matter because it's going to soak it up so quick. It's not going to leave any patterns or stripes or anything. That'll dry really evenly. So you just keep moving on down the back unfinished side of the belt. And I'd say we're just a hair over halfway. And I will have to put a little more dye in here. And it looks like I'm not going to quite use a half a bottle for the whole project. So the thing is, if I would have started with a half bottle and not a full bottle, I'd have been really close to running out. Or I could have run out, just depends. Especially if I would have to go back and give it a second coat for some reason. That would have really put me in a bind. But the second coat on any of this good dye it doesn't take near as much as the first coat. That makes a lot of sense. It covers really well, especially the darker colors. So I'm down here toward the end. Where my buckle's gonna go. Make sure I get the end of that real good. And you can see my container's pretty much empty. So I'll kind of take the rag, the little throwaway shop towel that I had, kind of clean up my mess on my cardboard, put my towel in my container, put my dauber, lay it on the container, and then what I'll do is I'll walk over to the trash can, drop that in while I have my gloves on, and then take my gloves off. I'll be right back. And as you can see, I don't have any of that dye on my hands or under my fingernails or anything. So those inexpensive vinyl gloves, you can buy them at a hardware store or big box store. I believe I bought some of these at Harbor Freight. So I know that Harbor Freight carries those nitrile gloves. So that's the dyeing process. So we have our belt dyed on both sides, the edges, and we'll let this sit and dry. Depending on how big a piece of leather it is, depends on, obviously how much dye you're going to put on it. That's going to depend on how many hours it's going to take to dry, or whether you apply some heat to it or whatever. Set it in front of a fan or anything that accelerates the drying time. I don't like to do that, because if you try to accelerate the drying time on paint, ink, dye, anything like that, what happens is it dries the outside first, and it doesn't let that medium that's in there evaporate out and just leave the pigment. So what it does is kind of accelerates the outside, and then the inside doesn't get to evaporate out. So I don't like to use a fan or a heater or anything like that. I just like to let it air dry. Takes a little longer, but I think you get a better product that way. So we're going to let this dry for a few hours, and then I'll bring you back and we'll go ahead and finish the project. All right, it's been about 3 hours since I put on the dye. So it's had 3 hours or so to dry. It does stiffen up a little bit once that dye dries on there. So that's kind of another test. You can touch it. Nothing's coming off on my hands, so I think we can go ahead and move on to putting it together. So that'll be our next step. Let's get rid of this dye cardboard. And let's pull this around. Have to slide on our holding strap. See how it fits really well. And I did groove that too, just for a little decoration, so that you could see how it turned out real pretty brown color. And you can see the basket weave really well. So we'll go ahead and put this on. We'll take our buckle
put it through. And we're going to take our holding strap, and I was going to put 4 rivets in this. I was going to try to put 2 on this side of the strap, between the buckle and strap, to capture that, and then I was going to put 2 on this side, but I think it's going to be fine without putting 2 in there. There's not a lot of movement, and I don't think I'm going to need those 2. So I'm just going to do the 2 on this side. That'll hold the belt together, that'll hold the buckle in there, and that'll hold the strap. So I think we're ready to go ahead and punch it for our rivets. So let's go ahead and move this. Get our mallet and our punch. And I'm going to go approximately a ½ inch back from where the leather ends on the underneath side. And then I'm going to go in a ½ inch from the edge of the belt. And I want to get through that top layer of that leather, but I want to leave a mark in the underneath layer so that I can fold that back and knock a hole in there. If I try to punch all the way through both thicknesses of leather, it's going to leave a bigger hole because this punch will stretch it out as it goes up the taper, and we don't want that. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. Go up about a ½ inch and in approximately a ½ inch from the side, and again I want to punch through that top thickness of leather and just enough to make a mark underneath. And if we take this and unfold it, I've got my 2 holes here that I just punched through, and I got my 2 marks on the underneath side. So I can go ahead and punch through those because I know exactly where they're going to meet up. And it didn't take a whole lot to get through that since I'd already made a mark there. Alright. So now I'm ready to pull my buckle back tight again and fold my belt over. I've got my holes on both pieces, so I'm ready to put my rivets in. So I'll put my rivet through the bottom hole underneath, sticks up to the top. Put my cap, rivet cap on, depress it by hand. I'm going to take my metal cup that'll hold that rivet still. Take my rivet tool, put it square on the rivet cap. Give it a couple of good whacks with that mallet, and that pulls it nice and tight. So there's the first rivet.
And again, you could buy rivets that are different lengths. I think you can buy kits that have assorted lengths in them. So you just have to kind of look around, and I think you can buy them in different colors, like brass colors, silver. These happen to be silver. Again, you want to make sure that underneath part is on that tool. Take my setter, give it a couple of good whacks, and there's my rivets on the front. There are the rivets on the back. And that is nice and sturdy. And then there's the strap that's going to hold the belt. So I put the belt in. Say I put it in the 4th hole. I can go ahead and put that through that holder. And there's the finished product. I got a nice, attractive, heavy-duty leather belt. That'll last for years. So this concludes the episode on finishing the basket weave leather belt. We've got our buckle on. The belt's riveted. It's ready to be used and worn. I appreciate you tuning in. I got a little surprise for you on the next episode. We're not going to make any leather products, but I've got a Western collection. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of that collection for the next episode. So I think you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next video.